Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Beckoned, Part 6, Adrift in New Zealand by Aviva Vaughn, and this is hosted by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1, New Courage, December 26th, 2002. Elena moaned, stretched her arms out to the side, and blinked her eyes open, the sound of rolling waves beckoning her to wake. She purred, enjoying the feeling of Soren's body pressed against hers, one arm looped under her neck, the other crossing her breasts possessively, his breath warm against her neck, tickling her ear, his erection hot against her ass. If you had told her 3 months ago that she'd wake up in the arms of some tourist from Denmark, she'd have laughed at you. But here she was, and it was wonderful. She drew in a deep breath. He smelled of pine and sea salt. What an amazing night, she thought, replaying the surprisingly wonderful Christmas dinner that she and Soren had hosted last night. It had been so nice to feel like a team with someone again. This past week of shopping, cooking, and decorating, while also parenting her 8-year-old, running her boutique hotel business, and giving surf lessons, was so much easier with another responsible adult to share the burden. Even during her son's infancy, when she and her ex, professional surfer Joaquin Santos, had still been together, it hadn't been like this. Not only had they been much younger and less mature, but Joaquin had been gone most of the time, off competing or fulfilling requirements for his sponsors. An old familiar anger rippled through her, a simmering heat that followed thoughts of Joaquin like contrails. Soren must have felt her discontent, even in his sleep, as he made a shushing sound in her ear, as though comforting a child. Closing her eyes, she took a few long breaths, trying to recall the begrudgingly pleasant feelings she'd felt towards Joaquin last night. She had to admit that he'd been on his best behavior. Not to mention generous, she thought, remembering the surfboards he'd gifted both her and Soren. Although there had been times, like last night, when she felt like maybe she was too hard on him, she couldn't seem to help the fact that just seeing him set her teeth on edge. Their history ran too deep to be ignored. There were painful crevices in her psyche that had been carved by him alone. But something had shifted last night, if only subtly. Seeing Joaquin with Soren, so mature and even-tempered, had been a revelation. If Joaquin could change, maybe she could as well. It was time to let go of her anger. It wasn't doing anyone any good. She sighed heavily, and it was as though the dried, dead petals of her heart had fallen away, and a fresh new bud had taken their place. She felt lighter. Let's hope it lasts. Soren murmured something in his sleep and pulled her tighter. A faint smile crossed her lips as she remembered the spectacular orgasms he'd given her last night. It had been a surprising end to a night that she had dreaded all week. Besides her own perma-angry feelings toward Joaquin, things had been uneasy between her and Soren ever since he had learned about the existence of her ex and their son, Diego. Of course, she accepted full responsibility for the discomfort since she had purposefully neglected to mention them, wanting selfishly to enjoy the feeling of being single and carefree once again. She squirmed a bit at the memory, a fresh wave of guilt washing over her. Add the unease between them with the presence of Joaquin, and she'd expected the dinner to be one to remember, but not in a good way. However, it had turned out to be one of the best Christmases she'd ever had. Maybe the best Christmas. The holidays hadn't been much fun for her and her older brother Nacho after their parents had died in a car crash when they were 12 and 15. And though her enjoyment of them had improved with the arrival of Diego, last night had been the first time she'd enjoyed herself with an open heart, no longer grieving the loss of her parents, no longer mourning the absence of Joaquin. Her heart felt whole again. There's only one thing missing. She shook her head, not wanting to let that thought take root. She turned back to last night, smiling as she remembered the after-party for two that had followed dinner, which had been beyond fantastic. Soren had opened Elena's heart, mind, and body. She sighed happily, certain that she hadn't felt this content, this satisfied, in years. She inhaled his cool, woodsy scent as she brushed his sandy blonde hair out of his sleeping face, studying the man who had repaired her heart. Although his eyes were shut, she could imagine the intensity of their oceanic depths. When they had first met, she had found his eyes to be stormy, tempestuous, but now when he looked at her, they seemed quieter, pacific. His eyelids fluttered gently, and he sighed, still deep asleep. She ran the tips of her fingers over his scratchy stubble and full pink mouth. He murmured quietly in response, licking his lips. The sight of his tongue sent a sharp ping straight to her clit. Dios mío. The effect he had on her body was unlike anything she had experienced before. She wanted to devour him and be devoured in turn. Her heart began speeding up as she remembered the view from last night of his head between her legs, her nipples hardening in response. Elena, he called softly, half asleep, his eyes still shut. See, she whispered. He gave a satisfied hum and pulled her closer, nuzzling her neck. You smell so good. She blushed. She'd never felt like such a woman before in all her life. It was intoxicating. He began moving slowly, stretching and yawning, his erection caressing the soft skin of her belly, creating a hum of desire in her gut. As he blinked his way to consciousness, a broad smile broke out on his face, and his deep blue eyes focused on her. Good morning, beautiful. A warm blush spread across her chest. Good morning, hermoso. She couldn't believe that this amazing man was between her sheets, although technically they were his sheets because he was her tenant. She laughed inwardly at their crazy situation. Although they'd only met 3 months ago, their lives had become deeply intertwined. In many ways, it seemed like they had known each other much longer, since they spent more than half of every day in each other's company between her role as his surf instructor and his role as an investor in her resort. Hermoso? Beautiful? He asked, his eyes questioning. Isn't guapo the right word for a man? His Spanish accent had improved so much in the time she'd known him. She shook her head. Guapo only means handsome on the outside. I like hermoso better, she said, placing her hand over his heart, because you are beautiful inside and out. The look on his face spoke of love and gratitude and desire. It took her breath away. If only I was still competing. The errant thought that she'd tried to push away earlier returned in full force. Come here, you, he said, pulling her close and crushing her lips with the intensity of his kiss, her thoughts evaporating with the heat of their desire. At that moment, there was nowhere else in the world she would rather be. They're here, Diego called out just before his mop of curly brown hair popped out of the screen door, his uncle and father close on his heels. Soren's heart clenched at the sound of the boy's voice, and he was reminded of how quickly Diego had seemed to take root in his chest. He and Elena grabbed the bags of food from the back of her vintage orange and white Land Rover as Nacho approached. What can I carry? Nacho asked, brushing his chin-length curly brown hair out of his eyes, his broad muscles flexing. Although shorter than Soren, Nacho took up more physical space with his ox-like build. Elena waved towards the back seat of her car. Lots of stuff in there. We brought the whole party. Soren and Elena had packed up the car with the leftovers from last night's Christmas dinner and transported them to her and Nacho's childhood home, where Nacho still lived, for brunch. As Soren walked through the screen door into the terracotta-tiled entryway, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee welcomed him. That smells good. I love cold tamales and hot coffee together, Elena said, unpacking the contents of her bag onto the rectangular wood dining table with curvaceous turned legs. I might have to have dessert first, Soren replied. The tres leches will taste amazing with coffee. Elena glanced around, gave him a mischievous look, and said quietly, I thought you already had dessert. You can never have too much dessert, his voice husky and low. A pang of desire shot through his torso. Their morning romp had been satisfying in so many ways. Waking up with Elena in his arms, and the truth out in the open, had touched him deeply. A few months ago, he hadn't thought his heart would ever heal, and while his relationship with Elena could not be compared to Angela, he was grateful to no longer be wallowing in grief the way he had been when he arrived in Costa Rica. Then his heart had been hurt anew, learning about Diego and Joaquin, after he'd already developed feelings for Elena. However, now that the sanitizing light of honesty had been shed, he found himself able to enjoy those feelings wholeheartedly. Although they still planned to keep their relationship low profile around Diego, it seemed there was no longer anything in their hearts holding them back. It was refreshing. Now they could see where this relationship could really go. He took a sip of the coffee Nacho had handed him, enjoying the chocolatey warmth of the brew as it wafted into his nostrils. I think that's everything, Joaquin said, putting the large dish of tamales on the table. Elena shook her head. Before we eat, there's an announcement I'd like to make. Her eyes lit up as she looked around at the small party. Soren, her brother, her son, and her ex. Every one of them was a spoke off the hub of Elena. For some reason, the thought poked at Soren like a mosquito bite, but he waved it away. What's this? Nacho asked, popping a bit of guanabana in his mouth. Soren's stomach grumbled, and he took a few steps over to the table to grab a piece of the fruit, his new favorite, that tasted like a less acidic pineapple but had the texture of a grainy banana. It was like nature's ice cream. I've decided to enter the surf competition. Elena jumped in the air, pumping her arms excitedly. Soren clapped, surprised and pleased at her change of heart, wondering what prompted it. Diego had begged Elena to enter the upcoming Playa Hibisco Pro-Am contest for weeks, but to no avail. Yay, Mama! Diego squealed, running into her arms. I can't wait to watch you compete. Elena enveloped Diego tightly and kissed the top of his curly, coppery hair, so like her own. Thanks, honey. It's because of you and Soren that I'm doing it, she said, shooting a loving smile in Soren's direction. Soren thought back to earlier in the morning when he and Elena had been cuddling in postcoital bliss. She'd mentioned that something had been bothering her all morning, and that she'd finally come to terms with it. When he'd asked what it was, she'd demurred, saying that she'd tell everyone at breakfast. This must have been the something. She had often mentioned to him her fears of competing, of leaving her son an orphan, like she had been when her parents died in a car crash when she was 15. And yet he'd also known that she grieved the loss of her identity as a competitor. He'd always sensed that she'd felt incomplete because of it. Elena is going to compete. His heart sped up. Part of him wished he could gather her up in his arms and swing her around, planting a deep kiss on her sultry lips, but he settled for a slightly awkward and platonic hug, still managing to enjoy the feeling of her strong, sinewy body pressed against his. They could celebrate later. Soren noticed the sad smile Joaquin gave her. That's great, Lena. I'm happy for you. He glanced at Soren and lifted his chin. Soren nodded back. He knew from their conversation last night how much Joaquin still cared for Elena. It must hurt that she was returning to surfing because of another man. The air was heavy with the weight of their complicated emotions. Well, I, for one, am stoked. Nacho picked up his sister and twirled her around. Soul Sister is back. I'm going to have shirts printed to sell at the store. Soul Sister? Soren asked. Elena tossed her head back and laughed, giving Soren a glimpse of the more carefree side of her that he'd only seen a handful of times before. He wondered if it was the weight of being a single mom and solo entrepreneur that made her guard this lighter side of her, Or maybe it was the loss of competitive surfing, clearly still her passion, that had hardened her. Soren had personally experienced how much lighter and happier he felt working on something he was passionate about rather than something that just paid the bills. And hopefully with his investment in Elena's property, his passion would not only fulfill him, but also feed him. Wouldn't that be nice?